The question of why strong women intimidate certain men runs deeper than social dynamics. It reaches into the very fabric of our psychological makeup, touching on what Carl Jung called the shadow, those parts of ourselves we've hidden away, denied, or never fully integrated. Think about a moment when you felt uncomfortable around someone who exuded confidence and strength. What was that feeling? Was it truly about them, or was it revealing something about yourself? In America, we've built cultural narratives around the strong woman, from political leaders to corporate executives, from single mothers raising families to activists challenging systems. Yet many of these women share similar experiences. Relationships where their strength becomes a source of tension rather than celebration. Jung would suggest this tension doesn't emerge randomly. It follows patterns as old as humanity itself, patterns that speak to our individual and collective unconscious. Consider John, a software engineer in Seattle who prided himself on being progressive and supportive of women's empowerment. Yet in his relationship with Rebecca, a startup founder, he found himself growing increasingly critical of her work hours, her assertiveness in social settings, her unwillingness to soften her opinions. Their relationship became a battleground, not because he consciously opposed strong women, but because her strength was triggering his unexamined shadow. The meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow, Jung wrote. The shadow is not just our darker impulses, but often qualities we've been taught to reject in ourselves. For many men raised in American culture, certain attributes have been coded as feminine, and therefore something to be rejected in themselves. Emotional vulnerability, nurturing instincts, the ability to compromise, to listen rather than solve. When these men encounter women who have integrated traditionally masculine qualities like assertiveness, independence, and ambition, it creates a psychological mirror that reflects their own incompleteness. This intimidation isn't about the woman's strength being inherently threatening. It's about what that strength reveals about the man's relationship with his own internal feminine energy, what Jung called the anima. In workshops across America, I've asked men to describe what they find intimidating about strong women. The answers reveal this shadow work. She doesn't need me. She might judge me. She can see through me. She won't accept my control. These aren't rational fears about the woman's behavior. They're projections of the man's relationship with parts of himself. The man who fears being unneeded has likely built his identity around being the provider, the protector. The man who fears being judged has often been his own harshest critic. The man who fears being seen through has parts of himself he hasn't yet faced. The man who fears losing control is often controlling himself in ways that limit his wholeness. This dance is equally revealing for women. When a woman encounters a man intimidated by her strength, she faces her own set of shadows. Does she dim her light to make him comfortable? Does she reject him outright, perhaps missing opportunities for growth? Does she become even stronger, more forceful, using his discomfort as fuel? Jung would see these patterns not as simple personality conflicts, but as opportunities for individuation, the process of becoming more wholly ourselves by integrating the disparate parts of our psyche. The American dating landscape is filled with these shadow dances. Dating apps connect people superficially, while the deeper psychological currents remain unaddressed. We wonder why relationships fail without examining how our collective and personal shadows shape our attractions and repulsions. What would it mean to approach these dynamics with consciousness? To recognize that when we feel intimidated, we're being invited to examine ourselves rather than change the other person. This journey begins with simple awareness. When you feel intimidated by someone's strength, pause. Ask yourself, what is this revealing about me? What part of myself am I seeing reflected back? What might be hiding in my shadow? When confronted with our shadow material, those aspects of ourselves that emerge in reaction to strong women, we stand at a threshold. We can retreat to familiar patterns, or we can begin the transformative work that Jung called individuation. This inner transformation isn't merely about understanding our reactions intellectually. It requires a profound alchemical process that changes us at our core. The intimidation that certain men feel around strong women often manifests as criticism, withdrawal, or attempts to diminish that strength. Consider the dynamics that play out in everyday American life. The male colleague who interrupts female executives twice as often as male ones. The dating partner who subtly undermines a woman's accomplishments. The societal messaging that women should be confident but not too confident. These behaviors aren't simply bad habits. They're expressions of an internal imbalance that Jung would recognize as a call toward wholeness. In my work with Mike, a construction manager from Detroit, this pattern became strikingly clear. Mike had dated a series of accomplished women, but his relationships inevitably dissolved when his partners advanced in their careers. "I'd start finding flaws," he admitted. Suddenly, her ambition seemed selfish. Her confidence became arrogance in my eyes. I'd pick fights about time spent working, though I worked just as much. What was happening in Mike's psyche? The strong woman in his life was activating what Jung called the anima, the feminine aspect within the male unconscious. When underdeveloped or unintegrated, the anima projects outward, casting female figures as either angels or demons, madonnas or whores, but rarely as complete human beings with natural complexities. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside. As fate, Jung wrote. Mike wasn't creating these tensions consciously. He was experiencing his own unintegrated feminine energy as an external threat. The transformative journey begins with naming this dynamic. For Mike, recognizing that his partners weren't causing his discomfort, but revealing it was the first painful step toward integration. His intimidation was showing him precisely where his own development had been stunted, in his capacity to value nurturing alongside strength, cooperation alongside competition, being alongside doing. This inner work isn't unique to men grappling with strong women. It's fundamental to any authentic growth. Jung called it holding the tension of opposites, the capacity to contain contradictory energies within ourselves without immediately resolving the discomfort they create. Sarah, a marketing executive from Chicago, described her own journey. "I'd been the strong woman all my life, proud of never needing anyone, never showing vulnerability. When I started dating Ben, his comfort with his own sensitivity intimidated me. I'd mock what I called his softness, not realizing I was attacking the very qualities I needed to develop in myself." The American cultural landscape often reinforces these splits. We valorize certain expressions of masculinity and femininity while stigmatizing others. Men learn to hide sensitivity. Women learn to downplay ambition. The result is a collective shadow that limits everyone's wholeness. Integration requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands lived experience and emotional honesty. For Mike, this meant developing his capacity for vulnerability and interdependence. He joined a men's group where he could practice emotional expression in a supportive environment. He began volunteering at a community garden, cultivating literal and figurative nurturing skills. He started journaling about his reactions when feeling threatened by female strength, tracking the sensations in his body, the memories that surfaced, the fears that emerged. "I realized I was carrying my father's voice, telling me I had to be the provider, the protector, the one in charge," Mike shared. "My partner's success made me feel like I was failing at masculinity, though consciously I supported their achievements." This recognition allowed Mike to begin disentangling his authentic desires from internalized expectations. The process wasn't linear. There were moments of resistance, regression, and renewed effort, what Jung might recognize as the necessary cycles of psychological growth. Integration also involves cultural work. American society is slowly creating new narratives about gender, relationship, and power. Communities are emerging, where men support each other in developing emotional intelligence, where women mentor each other in embracing ambition, where relationships are built on mutual growth rather than fixed roles. The key insight in this alchemical process is understanding that the qualities that intimidate us in others are precisely the qualities we need to develop in ourselves. The man intimidated by a woman's independence is being called to develop his own self-sufficiency. The woman unsettled by a man's emotional depth is being invited into her own vulnerability. Jung used the term complexes to describe these emotional hotspots where our conscious intentions clash with unconscious material. When activated, complexes create disproportionate reactions, anger, anxiety, or withdrawal that doesn't match the actual situation. They're like psychological landmines that signal where healing is needed. Have you noticed patterns in what triggers your discomfort in relationships? Perhaps certain types of people consistently unsettle you, or specific behaviors reliably provoke strong reactions. These patterns aren't random. They're maps to your own interior terrain, showing exactly where integration is needed. The process of addressing these complexes involves turning toward them with curiosity, rather than judgment. When Mike felt threatened by his partner's success, he learned to ask, what part of me is activated right now? What am I afraid of losing? What might I gain by embracing rather than resisting this quality? This inner dialogue creates space between stimulus and response. Rather than automatically criticizing his partner's ambition, Mike could recognize his own fear, sit with the discomfort, and choose a response aligned with his values rather than his complex. Integration doesn't mean erasing all differences between masculine and feminine energies. Jung saw these polarities as essential creative tensions within the psyche. Rather, integration means developing flexibility and wholeness, the capacity to access strength and vulnerability, assertion and reception, doing and being as circumstances require. What would relationships look like if both partners approach their tensions as opportunities for growth rather than battles to be won? What might be possible if we saw the qualities that intimidate us not as threats but as teachers, revealing precisely what we need for our own completion? The dance between men and women, particularly when strong feminine energy meets undeveloped masculine consciousness, unfolds within a rich tapestry of archetypal patterns. These archetypes, universal symbolic templates that Jung identified as residing in our collective unconscious, shape our attractions, repulsions, and transformations in ways that transcend individual psychology. To understand why certain men are intimidated by strong women at the deepest level, we must explore the archetypal dimensions at play. These aren't merely theoretical constructs, but living psychological forces that animate our relationships, often outside our awareness. The most fundamental archetype in this dynamic is the anima-animus complex, the contrasexual inner figure that represents our relationship with the opposite gender's energy. For men, the anima is their inner feminine. For women, the animus is their inner masculine. These archetypal energies don't simply exist within us, they actively shape how we perceive and relate to others. Consider Jason, a financial analyst from Boston, whose dating history revealed a pattern. He was initially attracted to accomplished, independent women, only to begin undermining their confidence months into the relationship. I'd find myself making subtle digs about their choices, questioning their decisions, he reflected. I wasn't even aware I was doing it until my third girlfriend called me out. Through psychological work, Jason discovered he was carrying an undeveloped anima projection. His initial attraction represented his soul's recognition of qualities he needed to integrate: independence, emotional intelligence, creative expression. But without conscious awareness, this attraction transformed into a compulsion to control or diminish these very qualities in his partners. This pattern reveals what Jung called projection, the unconscious transfer of our internal content onto external figures. When a man projects his undeveloped anima onto women, he doesn't see them clearly as individuals. Instead, he sees the carriers of his own unlived feminine potential. The American cultural landscape has historically reinforced these projections. Through media, religion, education, and family structures, women have been cast as madonnas or temptresses, nurturers or destroyers, rarely as complete human beings containing all these potentials and more. Men have been similarly constrained by limiting archetypes of masculinity: the provider, the warrior, the stoic. These cultural patterns create what Jung called persona adaptations, the masks we wear to conform to social expectations. Many American men have developed strong personas around certain masculine traits, while relegating their feminine qualities to the shadow. When these men encounter women who embody both masculine and feminine energies in an integrated way, it creates archetypal turbulence. In workshops throughout the Midwest and coasts alike, I've observed powerful archetypal configurations emerge. As men discuss their experiences with strong women, 4 patterns appear with striking regularity: the hero and the Amazon. Many men approach relationships through the hero archetype, the part of themselves that conquers, protects, and provides. When they encounter a woman embodying the Amazon archetype, self-sufficient, bold, requiring no rescue, it creates an archetypal impasse. The hero's purpose is called into question. Without someone to save, who is he? This archetypal collision often manifests as complaints that she doesn't need me, or attempts to create situations where she must rely on him. The king and the queen. The mature masculine archetype of the king represents order, blessing, and generative power. When a man operating from an undeveloped king energy meets a woman embodying the queen archetype, commanding respect, wielding authority, radiating confidence, He often experiences it as a threat to his sovereignty. His kingdom, whether psychological or literal, seems at risk. This dynamic appears in relationships where men insist on having the final word or undermine their partner's authority in subtle ways. The magician and the witch. The magician archetype represents specialized knowledge, perception, and transformation. Men identified with their expertise or intellectual prowess may feel threatened by women embodying the witch archetype, intuitive, wielding natural wisdom, transforming environments through their presence. This often emerges as dismissal of women's intuitive knowledge, insistence on credentials, or attempts to control the narrative through explaining. The lover and the muse. The lover archetype represents connection, passion, and aesthetic appreciation. Men strongly identified with this energy often seek women who will be their muse, inspiring them but not creating their own independent works. When these men encounter women who are both muse and creator, both inspiring and producing, it can trigger deep insecurity. Their response often involves subtly discouraging her creative pursuits or making her success about him. These archetypal conflicts aren't simply personal failings, but invitations to collective evolution. They point toward new configurations of masculine and feminine energies that might transcend these ancient tensions. The journey toward archetypal integration involves first recognizing which patterns are active in our relationships. For Richard, a teacher from Minneapolis, this recognition came during a relationship with Elena, a successful artist whose career was flourishing while his remained stable. "I noticed I'd get irritable when she talked about her gallery openings," Richard shared. "I'd find reasons why her successes weren't as impressive as they seemed. I was behaving like someone I didn't recognize or respect." Through dream work, a Jungian approach that honors the unconscious as a source of wisdom, Richard began encountering symbolic representations of his relationship with feminine energy. In one significant dream, he found himself in a castle where a queen offered him a place at her table, not as a consort, but as an equal advisor. The dream challenged his unconscious assumption that in any relationship, someone must be subordinate. I realized I was operating from a story where relationships are hierarchical, Richard said. Elena's success felt threatening because I believed if she was ascending, I must be descending. The dream showed me a different model entirely, one where we could both occupy positions of honor. This insight points to the transformative potential of archetypal awareness. By recognizing the ancient patterns playing through our modern relationships, we gain the capacity to consciously engage with them, rather than being unconsciously driven by them. Dreams aren't the only avenue for accessing archetypal content. Active imagination, Jung's method of dialoguing with inner figures, offers another approach. American culture has historically devalued imagination as merely fantasy, but Jung recognized it as a vital psychological faculty that allows access to unconscious wisdom. Michael, an architect from Austin, used active imagination to address his pattern of being attracted to strong women, but then feeling diminished by their strength. He visualized his anima, his inner feminine, and engaged in written dialogues with this figure over several months. At first, she appeared as a critical goddess who judged everything I did as inadequate, Michael reported. But as I continued the dialogues with genuine curiosity, she transformed. I began to see that what I perceived as her criticism was actually her holding a higher vision for me than I held for myself. This inner work gradually transformed Michael's outer relationships. He became less intimidated by strong women because he was developing a healthy relationship with his own feminine energy. Rather than projecting his insecurities onto his partners, he could recognize them as internal messages, pointing toward his growth. The archetypal dimension also helps explain why these patterns are so persistent across generations and cultures. These aren't merely individual psychological issues, but expressions of collective evolutionary tensions. The intimidation that certain men feel around strong women reflects a broader cultural initiation, the transformation of patriarchal consciousness into something more balanced and whole. Jung observed that genuine psychological growth often requires engaging with symbolic death and rebirth. For men accustomed to defining their worth through traditional masculine archetypes, the encounter with integrated feminine strength can feel like an ego death. Their familiar identity is challenged, creating anxiety that manifests as intimidation or opposition. The key insight is that this archetypal death is not an ending but a threshold. On the other side, lies the possibility of a more complete masculine identity, one that incorporates rather than opposes feminine strength. This evolutionary perspective helps explain why some men, those Jung might call more individuated, are not intimidated by strong women, but actively seek their company. These men have already undergone aspects of this initiatory process, integrating enough of their feminine energy to recognize strong women not as threats, but as allies in the journey toward wholeness. Thomas, a carpenter from Oregon, described his transformation. "In my 20s, I was constantly competing with my girlfriends, always needing to know more, achieve more. By my 40s, after doing my inner work, I found myself genuinely celebrating women's strength. I realized their success didn't diminish me. It created more possibilities for authentic connection." This shift reflects what Jung called the emergence of the self, the central organizing archetype of the psyche that transcends and includes the ego. Where the ego sees competition and threat, the self perceives complementarity and wholeness. The archetypal approach also illuminates why strong women often find themselves repeatedly attracting men who become intimidated by their strength. This pattern may reflect the woman's own animus development, her relationship with inner masculine energy. If a woman's animus is configured around proving herself in traditionally masculine arenas, she may unconsciously select partners who challenge this proof, creating relationships where her strength must be continually demonstrated rather than simply embodied. Melissa, a CEO from San Francisco, recognized this pattern in her own life. "I kept attracting men who initially seemed supportive, but eventually tried to dim my light. Through my own inner work, I realized I was choosing these men because they reflected my own inner critic, the part of me that questioned whether I deserved my success." As Melissa developed a healthier relationship with her animus, recognizing her achievements as authentic expressions rather than compensations, she naturally began attracting partners who could truly celebrate her strength. This mutual evolutionary process points toward what Jung might call a conjunctio, a sacred marriage of masculine and feminine energies, both within individuals and between them. The intimidation that has characterized so many heterosexual relationships throughout American history isn't the final word, but a necessary tension in this alchemical process. The emerging archetypal configuration is neither traditionally patriarchal nor simply role-reversed. It's something genuinely new, a model where masculine and feminine energies can each express their fullness without diminishing the other. We can see early expressions of this new configuration throughout American culture, in relationships where partners genuinely celebrate each other's strengths, in workplaces that value both traditionally masculine and feminine approaches, in spiritual practices that honor the sacred in all gender expressions. These examples aren't just hopeful anecdotes, but evidence of collective archetypal evolution. They suggest that the intimidation certain men feel around strong women isn't just a personal problem to be solved, but a cultural growing pain as we move toward more complete expressions of human potential. Jung believed that psychological growth isn't merely personal, but serves a larger purpose, what he called answering a calling from the self. When men do the inner work to move beyond being intimidated by strong women, they aren't just improving their relationships, they're participating in a collective evolution of consciousness. This perspective offers dignity to the struggle. The man working to overcome his intimidation isn't merely fixing a personal flaw, but engaging with archetypal forces that have shaped human relationships for millennia. His individual growth contributes to a broader transformation. Similarly, the strong woman navigating these dynamics isn't simply dealing with immature partners, but helping catalyze an evolutionary process. Her refusal to diminish herself, despite social pressures, represents an archetypal standpoint that benefits the collective. What becomes possible when we approach these tensions not merely as personal incompatibilities, but as archetypal invitations? How might our relationships transform if we recognize that the qualities that intimidate us in others are precisely the qualities we need to develop in ourselves? The Jungian approach suggests that genuine growth happens not by avoiding these tensions, but by consciously engaging them, holding the discomfort long enough for something new to emerge. This alchemical container isn't created through techniques or strategies, but through presence and awareness. For men intimidated by strong women, the path forward isn't about developing better pickup lines or relationship hacks. It's about the courageous inner work of facing their shadows, engaging their anima, and allowing their definition of masculinity to evolve beyond opposition to the feminine. For strong women repeatedly encountering this intimidation, the journey involves discernment, distinguishing between men capable of growth and those committed to limitation. It means neither diminishing their light to accommodate insecurity, nor using their strength as a weapon, but embodying it as a natural expression of their wholeness. The archetypal perspective reminds us that these patterns have deep historical and psychological roots. They won't transform overnight through willpower or intellectual understanding alone. The journey requires patience, compassion for ourselves and others as we stumble forward, and trust in the inherent wisdom of the individuation process. Yet, the rewards of this journey extend far beyond improved dating prospects. As Jung observed, the integration of masculine and feminine energies within the psyche creates an internal marriage that generates creativity, wisdom, and genuine spiritual connection. The outer relationships we form after doing this inner work take on a different quality, less driven by unconscious complexes and projections, more grounded in authentic seeing and appreciation. Perhaps most importantly, this archetypal work contributes to healing the broader cultural wounds around gender, power, and relationship. Each man who does the inner work to move beyond intimidation, each woman who maintains her strength with wisdom and compassion, helps create new possibilities for those who follow. In a culture still struggling with balancing masculine and feminine expressions, these individual journeys create pathways for collective evolution. They demonstrate that integration isn't about blending all differences into sameness, but about allowing each energy its full, distinct expression in a dance of mutual respect and celebration. The intimidation certain men feel around strong women isn't a simple problem to be solved, but a complex archetypal dynamic pointing toward our next evolutionary threshold. By engaging it consciously, we participate in an ancient alchemical process with revolutionary potential. The creation of relationships where strength meets strength, not in opposition, but in creative partnership.